Hello. Welcome to the Institute for the Study of Consciousness. We're here for one of a number of conversations on various topics in consciousness, philosophy, and science. We're having these kinds of conversations with Arthur Young, who is the director of the Institute, an author, a cosmologist, an inventor. Our guest today is Dr. Elizabeth Rauscher, a nuclear physicist and astrophysicist who is interested in issues in the scientific method and the relationship of science to consciousness. Dr. Rauscher is taught at the University of California at Stanford University and is currently a professor at John F. Kennedy University. We're going to be discussing a number of questions today that have to do with the way consciousness and science relate to each other as philosophical topics. The first thing we want to talk about has to do with the faith that people have in science. A lot of people look to science these days for verification. They look to science for the kind of ultimate answers that people are perhaps more traditionally look to religion for. Is there a problem with people looking at science that way? Is science an appropriate target for people's religious aspirations? Does that create a problem for the people with those belief systems? Does it create a problem for science?
I think that's probably true, that people nowadays are looking to science for answers that formerly they looked towards religion. I think you would say that the Western culture is a science-based culture. It is a show it to me, prove it to me culture within the scientific framework, although of course there are organized religions. What are the questions that are being addressed by religion and science is what is the nature of reality and meaning of life. Now, of course, meaning, and we can get into that in more detail, what we mean by meaning. But I think there has been a hope by people that science would be able to be a methodology to come up with some of these answers. And now that it appears that it's failed to give a comprehensive, complete picture of reality, there has been sort of a loss in faith in the method. Whereas I think that is not so much the method of science, but the use of science. The scientific method has a very specific format for investigating reality, and it has a very specific use, but there's also a limit to this phenomena, limit to this methodology, and understanding the limits in the use of science is extremely important in addressing itself to these questions, because we have to ask what kinds of answers can we get from it, and what kinds of answers may be beyond the scientific method. Would you like to comment?
I don't think I have any comment. I agree with you.
Well, I mean, does it create problems for people when they look at science as a source of metaphysical answers, or are they going to get into a kind of trouble?
I don't even know how to answer that. What I would say was that it blocks their thought processes, but so does any faith. So in that way, you couldn't criticize it. What annoys me is the presumption that because the scientific method works in a certain area, that it can speak for religious themes or be used to knock down religion as a superstition, or be used to attack values, any of these things which are, I would assume, reals, and if you want to say, well, they have no scientific reality, then I would say that's a limit to scientific reality. It's not a limit to the fact that it doesn't tell me that values don't exist.
Is anyone really taking that position, Arthur? Is anyone really saying that values don't exist? That anyone other than a few naive sophomores saying that doing one thing is as good as
sophomores. Well,
as good as another?
I don't know whether it's the occasion, but the story that comes to mind, I was asked to, a friend of mine teaches philosophy to some high school seniors, and she asked me to come and tell them about my theory. And I came, and first we listened to them doing their homework, doing their assignment, which consisted of an assessment of these three things. Let me see if I can remember them. 1984, Walden 2, and Brave New World. And the student was saying that they were all equivalent and so forth. And the teacher said, well, don't you think Huxley, whose Brave New World was one of them, didn't he think that Huxley had his tongue in his cheek when he was writing the Brave New World, because he really didn't like it at all? And the student said, oh, you shouldn't say that. That's a value judgment. Now, that shows that it's a dangerous disease that's spreading.
Yes.
And I've heard many people talk about values are just relative, of course, in the South Sea Islands, this and that, and so on, and so there really is no absolute values, and et cetera, et cetera. Well, I think it's not only a usurpation of an area that doesn't belong to science by their own definition. And mind you, Darwin was used to knock down the whole framework of religion. I don't see how the scientists can claim they were not involved in that. They were pushing it as hard as they could.
I very much concur with what Arthur's saying, because what I feel is that the whole idea of experience, the emotional aspect, value, judgment, purpose, has been eliminated from the school system. We teach really the left hemisphere. We teach, I'm using a vernacular that we can't demonstrate, but it's a common vernacular in the culture. But we teach analytical, in other words, logic, logos, the word. We teach analytical. Ration comes from reason or ratio. We teach these kind of frameworks, which came from the ancient Greek philosophers. But we do not teach people to deal with experience and be aware of their emotional states and have the same kind of control over those that we have over adding 1 and 1 and getting 2. And so that I feel it's sort of like half of the person is being educated. And in the scientific revolution of Galileo, Copernicus, etc., that was a fight against religion, but at that point the religion was corrupt. So the science had value when it was fighting a corrupt system. But now we are actually at the other swing of the pendulum, in which we're using science to, and I do know scientists that really use it like a religion. In other words, that is it. There is nothing beyond that. And even just asking whether there is purpose or meaning or value is an irrelevant question, because it can't be answered by science, which is a correct supposition. But then they aren't looking to anything beyond that system. And I think that that's the problem, that is not only a problem for science, but it is a problem for society, it's a problem for education, it's a problem for health. We keep thinking we'll find the pill to solve cancer.
I get from what both of you are saying that there are two difficulties here that really ought to be fairly clearly distinguished. On one hand, there's looking to science for ultimate answers.
Right.
And on the other hand, they're saying science is everything and there are no ultimate answers because it's in fact improper to look to science for ultimate answers. It seems to me those are two very different sorts of mistakes in ways that we think about science, and we ought to keep some clarity about that distinction when we go about.
I think that's what's important, because you see, science is an exceedingly valuable tool. It is a very nice tool in the sense that you can go through a certain set of protocol and come up with a consensus reality. In other words, I can roll a ball down an incline plane and someone else can do it. We can time its rate of ascent, get the same result. I mean, that's a very important thing, because in other words, we can make an agreement reality. So it has great power in its use. But we also have to recognize that it may not have power in certain areas of human values or endeavors that could be outside of its scope. That doesn't mean that certain things that we've said that were mystical aren't amenable to the scientific method, because I think that we use science in a very limited way currently. It's mostly used in its analytical form, not in its synthetic form, that is, taking parts and creating a model or holistic view of something. We're using it in a very analytical fashion of just analyzing down to, one more particle and
Right.
one more resonance
Right.
state. So that actually the use of science is actually limited in its total definition of its methodology. But on the other hand, maybe in its full methodology, it will never be able to address itself to certain questions.
I got it. Got it. Arthur, this leads real directly into the next question I wanted to ask, which is about the scope of science. And the question is, let me suggest two alternatives about the scope of science and ask you which one you think is appropriate. On the one hand, we can simply say, well, this is science, and potentially there's only this much that it can deal with, and maybe we can push the frontiers back a little, but there's some questions that we just can't ever look at, and they're bound to be outside of science. That's one alternative. The other alternative is to say, well, now science deals with this much, and later it'll deal with this much, and later it'll deal with this much, and we should keep looking for new paradigms that attempt to include more and more and more into science, sort of without worrying about whether ultimately it can include everything. If you can keep in mind what the two alternatives are, sort of fixed boundary and expanding boundary. Which one do you think is the appropriate way to define the scope?
I don't think it's comprehensive enough. See, the notion that we will any day now extend the boundaries doesn't suggest that there's any concern about the foundations being correct. And I would like to say that I think the foundations are incorrect. And I suppose the most drastic thing I'd have to say would be that if they would, be prepared to revise their whole approach, they could solve their own problems better than they're doing it now.
Could you elaborate on that?
Well, we sit here with this worshipful attitude toward the great God, science. From some points of view, I could say, well, science never discovered anything. It was people. You don't say that music discovered the pianoforte, or music discovered the Mozart symphonies. Mozart discovered his symphonies.
Right.
And many of these theories were advanced by people who were totally offbeat so far as the science was concerned. I mean, now we incorporate it, and science gets the credit for Galileo and for Rutherford and for Planck and for all these people who were outcasts at the time they were first
Even
writing.
Kepler.
Definitely, yes. He
Well,
was an astrologer to
I
start
know.
with,
Go ahead, Arthur.
Well, let's see, where were we? I wanted to say that it was time to look at science on a deeper level, and I think improve science, quite apart from the question of restoring the dignity of man. But to put it more concretely, ask science, how do you explain life? Life, L-I-F-E.
Mhm.
Right.
I got you.
You feel science ought to try.
I don't think it hasn't got the capacity. They may have tried. I read these things about computers running around in circles and things, and they say they're catching up
alive.
any day now. They'll catch it, but or even this thing about discharging lightning in atmosphere of methane, and you get some amino acids. Well, that isn't life. I mean, that's some of the necessities, but that isn't the same as life. But I would say that if science were prepared to revise itself, it might be able to approach the problem. And
I certainly think the methodology can be expanded within the scientific framework.
that's what I question, you see.
Uh,
Here they're like that Cottrell article,
mhm.
where he starts out with a reductionist thesis because it's been so successful, and he tries it out on life, and he himself admits it's despair. Doesn't get anywhere.
Well, the thing is this. What I would have to, my viewpoint would be something of this sort, that after all, see, my perception of that table really is a small image on my retina. You know, photons are bouncing off and going into my mind.
Fiddlesticks, how do we know that? That's all.
I'm giving a scientific explanation. But what I'm saying ultimately is it is my consciousness, it is in my mind that I have an image. In other words, I can't see that table in its full extent. I cannot perceive everything about that table. I believe I perceive that there is a table there. See what I mean? In other words...
Well, this is somewhat similar to Cottrell's position that you're saying that that is a table is due to your ignorance of the exact motion of all the particles, is what he said.
That's what I'm saying. In other words, what I'm saying is ultimately is human consciousness, my consciousness, that is the measure of anything that I say, perceive, or do, whether it's science or playing the piano or painting.
No, but are you speaking as a scientist when you say this is in your consciousness?
I'm speaking of the. I'm speaking as a human being. That
Well,
is my observation.
Well,
because we are making a division here. We are making. I think we are making a difference. See, there's a tendency to say, okay, science is that domain that deals with the objective, right?
well, that's where I
And then
really
there's-
start screaming
Yes,
and yelling.
That's.
But
I know.
Look, if you're going to be,
Well, I think it's a much too grandiose notion. I think, you know, science is just about observing things and writing them down carefully and putting
Well,
the
that's what
observations
I'm
on
going to
cards.
argue. So that's
Right.
what I want to argue
which
towards.
side are you going to be on, the
Well,
scientist
that's-
or the non-scientist? Because
I-
I'll take the opposite.
Well, well, you have to decide ahead of time. What my point will be something of this sort. I was just thinking about that. Okay, actually, I would say that table is brown, and so that I could probably get other people to agree with me that it is brown. It depends on how the TV color is adjusted on their set, but it will. It appears brown to me. But that I cannot experience. What I'm saying is, there's always an element in every observation that I cannot experience your experience of that table. Now, there are states in meditation that people talk of, like they talk about seeing the blue pearl of spiritual wisdom, and there is still, supposedly that's the domain of the subjective or projective, as Arthur refers to it, that there still seems to be a consensus reality because you can still discuss it and compare what kind of blue it is and so forth. So we have this so-called dividing line that's supposed to be, you know, that is either objective or subjective. And I think that issue is extremely crucial. And I will turn this back to Arthur, because he has a way of trying to define the difference between these two. And that may be that some of the discussions and arguments really are over that issue. There is or there is not a dividing line, or if there is, where it is. So I'll let Arthur discuss that for a bit.
Well, see, I'm experiencing ambivalence myself because in this argument, I'm being on the side of a scientist, I won't say the scientist, that I'd like to formalize and make it clear what this distinction is between the information that's coming from us and the colorations, I would call it values, that we project on the objects, you see. And these are, to me, two opposite aspects. And I like to draw out the implications of oppositeness. In other words, you describe them with opposite words. That hardness, or whatever I get from the table in the way of information, let's say, oh, that's a fake walnut. That's information coming from this particular object that I only learn contrary to my expectations, because I expected it to be real walnut, but then I examined it. On the other hand, I might make generalizations about, I can't stand this imitation Chinese art or something, some projection that I put on it.
Value.
Well, the projection is general because it would cover anything in that class, whereas the information about this particular one, it's that it's a fake, is particular. So there's the contrast of general and particular, as well as the contrast of projective and object. Objectives coming from
Right,
there
this is
to
one
me.
particular table,
Yeah.
and there are many tables in the universe that we can,
Right.
and we can identify that class that this is a table.
Right.
That's the first thing to
It's just
perhaps.
amazing how much time metaphysicians spend talking specifically about tables.
I know,
It
but
seems to be an extraordinarily
anything else
popular.
would do. Chairs, whatever.
Well, chairs are
Popular
the other
topic.
one. Chairs, but there's stools now. You know, there's a very important distinction between stools and chairs.
Well, I want to finish this because you gave me this opening,
Okay.
which is, if I proceed with this method, we recognize that there are two opposite things, and they're opposite in two qualities: particular
And general.
and general versus projective and objective.
Right.
Now, if you pair those the other way, and you get a different polarity or a different dichotomy. And I say, according to mathematics and everything else, we can look for the things that meet the description of that alternate way of pairing the things. So the first alternate way is the general and objective. And that very clearly applies to the concept table or
Right.
the concept chair. It's a general, it won't identify one particular one, and it's objective because we can pass it around between us and know what we mean, but it's
Right.
not physical.
That's right. It's a concept.
Yeah. Well, then the other one is the most interesting, the projective particular. And that's what I would relate to this ghost, this teleology or purpose or intention. But now I've given it formal status, you see. And I would call that the scientific method, but somebody else wouldn't. But I still call it the scientific method, that I've proceeded in an orderly fashion to account for what's accountable and to sort of deduce what's not there in a physical sense, but is indicated by the formalism.
Could you give an example?
Well, we were talking about the table
yes.
and the famous Aristotle. There's nothing really new about what I'm saying. It's the good old Aristotelian. I don't want to buy all of Aristotle, but he referred to these four causes. The material cause was the wood that went into the table, which could be made into any kind of table or other things besides table, so it's general. And the blueprint of the table, which he called the formal cause, which is again general because it could make a number of tables. The carpenter who shaped the wood according to the blueprint, and this is quite important that he combines those other two, and that would give you the efficient cause. In other words, the work that made that table. Effic is based on the word facio or making.
Right.
And finally, the final cause, which is the purpose. Now, nobody talks about that. It said that man is just a machine, therefore he has no purpose. But have you ever seen a machine that didn't have a purpose?
I've also seen them used for the wrong purpose, and that makes very clear what purpose is.
Right. Well, you see, I took that time to show that I think it's possible to proceed scientifically about areas that are normally excluded from the scientific domain, and that's why I think it's awfully prissy of the scientists to insist not only that they won't go there, but that I don't go there.
Yes, I agree with that strongly, very strongly. I think that censorship and dogmatism are very dangerous. Would this be a fair statement that what you're saying is that the scientific method, the way it's practiced today, might be inappropriate to apply to certain areas, but that it's a methodology that could be expanded to include those areas if certain aspects of it were redefined?
That goes back to what you said before. It assumes that they start and stay with the present assumptions, and I don't think you can do that. You have to recognize that the projective, well, let's say the subjective. See, subjective is a no-no for science. But is Harris's feelings about what I'm saying subjective to me? No. And it's not objective to me either. But I can't deny its existence. So therefore, I use the word projective, which includes me and him, We don't necessarily
Because it's a
have...
relationship, it's a connection.
Well, it's something that he creates and I create for me. But,
And your interpretation of it.
well, wait a sec. My interpretation would be different from the actual thing that he did.
But there's that connection that ultimately
Well, that
you
might
have
be
to...
the kind of connection I was separating out. Because my interpretation could be, it would be dangerous for me to mix that in. I have to grant him his projectivity, and he has to grant me mine, and so on. But where it comes to science, I have to ask the scientist, say the universe itself has projective properties. And one particular example we didn't finish was force.
Right.
Force is something you cannot conceptualize, but it's projected by things. That's why.
That's a fascinating point because even in mechanics, where force appears to be more obvious, it's still very, it's a concept. There's two things I would, well, many, but two major things in science, it appears to me, that are crucial, that in some sense sometimes scientists think they understand, but I consider key and perhaps not really understood, and that is force and time.
They have that same quality of subjectivity.
That's right. I mean, you say, well, this chronometer measures the passage of time, but what is it measuring? Well, it's a device that is composed of matter and energy, and it's doing something. And but what aspect is it measuring? And we define that as some kind of an absolute time, but there seems to be demonstrated in particle physics and relativity, and perhaps in fields like parapsychology, that there is transcendence of time. There are different space-time continuums, and this so-called immutable phenomena that's supposed to be somehow totally intrinsic to the universe, in which we have no part in it, may not be the case at all. It may be the case is completely wrapped up in phenomena, in the phenomena itself that occurs so-called in time. And force, the same thing, dynamics. These are crucial areas, as you mentioned in a little paper I read of yours recently, about the discussion of the invention of the calculus to define dynamics. And of course we say that force causes dynamics. And there again, we get into prior, ladder, what causes what. When we talk about a force, say if we're going to push the table, we apply a force and there's a certain acceleration of this mass.
This leads into one of the subjects we were thinking of discussing from the original list of questions, which is there's this claim that I've made from time to time that force is not an abstraction at all, but that it's extremely primary, and that things like mass and extension, which are normally thought of as primary, are actually abstractions.
That's your...
Very fascinating.
Other people have said it, but I'm claiming that I can feel that I'm actually perceiving the force that's pushing back on my hand, and there's this abstraction called extension that's associated with the table that I abstract from the fact that that force goes away when I push over here, but yet I can feel it when I push over here, and I build up this construct called extension in space.
Well, that is precisely along the line of thinking.
Definitely, Arthur's mentioned this too, that the concept of process. Let's distinguish it this way. In the West, I mentioned before logos, the word. We think of the objects in physics as particles, as noun terms. Table, chair, all of these are considered primary in Western culture, and yet there are many philosophies, like in Hinduism, in which the concept of process, dynamics, is key. In other words, it's a verb culture. Even Spinoza brought this out to some degree, that it's not being that's essence, but it's becoming that's essence. And there are some physics theories beyond Arthur's that are beginning to speak of possibly developing a concept of the world in terms of consideration as some aspect of dynamics, a process as being more primary than the object world.
I believe there actually are some human languages in which one says, well, it's tabling over here, and over here it's empty
not
spacing.
Tabling. Yes, okay.
Which somehow seems a lot more in touch with what we know from
You might
from
say
particle
that
physics.
you can make a table over there by applying a force.
It's true. It's absolutely true.
But I think this is there are some physicists now exploring what it would mean to develop an idea based on process as primary, whereas you see in particle physics we're trying to find there's always the idea, I'm going to find the essence particle of this table, that if I just knew what this particle was and where its position was, or the set of particles and their positions, that I could comprehend the table. I mean, that is a philosophy that again comes from the Greeks, from atomism, atom meaning indivisible. Now we're into quarks and charm and gluons and all kinds of things. But it's still like I'm going to divide it up and find this essence of tableness. And that may not be a viable concept. It may be that you have excluded immediately the concept of force, although it is brought in a certain way as a relationship of these particles. But still, the object concept is supposedly the fundamental aspect. And if you turn that around and say maybe there's a fundamental process or set of processes that give rise to tableness, you would have a whole new approach that might be very fascinating, very fascinating. And I think Arthur should comment on some of his concepts of process, because this is one of the things
Well, I
he's
don't
brought
know
up.
who these people are that are having a theory of process, but
I was thinking of David Finkelstein of Yeshiva University. You know, he had said that he had suggested a model in which the dynamic aspect of the universe might be either on an equal footing or perhaps more fundamental than the particle aspect.
well, I certainly agreed with that thing that I happen to have at hand when I wrote to you,
Yes.
where David Finkelstein pointed out that all this talk about higher dimensions overlooked the fact that time was ordering rather than metric. That is to say, it gave the sequence of things, and if you had many time dimensions, you couldn't give an inevitable sequence. Or
you would have levels of sequencing, which is more like the hierarchical concept that David Bohm has presented.
well, I was leaving it where David left it, that time provided the order. In other words, A, B, C is one order, but A, C, B is another.
Mm-hmm.
And the function of time is to establish order. And incidentally, Eddington referred to this way back in the fundamental theory when he spoke of making invariant transformations and this and that and so forth. It's all very well, you move the ruler around, you get a transformation of coordinates, but no one ever thinks of the order in which you make the steps of the measurement. And he implied, or I think he implied, because it was on the next page, that this would distinguish between substance and form. Substance being the order which you take things, and form the metric or relationship between the things.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And I think this is getting pretty technical, but
Yeah, I would
for
involve-
me it's basic. It's the same as the difference between values, which are substance,
Mm-hmm.
and metric, which is concept, or mythos and logos.
Mm-hmm.
See, value, force, those all things go together.
It's not clear to me why order is so much more.
This was
property-
his word. I
property
would.
I mean, I understand.
Order in the medieval sense, of one thing being higher than another, rather than order like put your papers in order.
Well, sequence.
Sequence would be a
Sequence.
better
But
word.
are you saying that sequence isn't a property of the spatial dimensions?
Right. You could take, if I was describing a square like your notebook, I could start at any corner and go around it. The point is that the squareness exists in simultaneity. It isn't a question of sequence.
Oh, I see.
But if man bites dog, that has one meaning, but dog bites man has another meaning. The sequence changes. Now
Well,
you
it
can
seems
get
like
even
you're
more
talking about
violent.
more than one use. That there's levels of use of time. You can use time as a fourth dimension of space in the relativity theory, which in a sense you're arguing against.
But
also-
I don't know whether you want to take time to do this now, but this is
Maybe
an
we
issue.
can get into this later.
Right.
But this is the issue that I'm sure that's on your mind on that. But one.
No, I was simply taking Finkelstein at his word. That
Yeah.
the first thing to devolve or come out of the chaos or the original beginning of things was this ordering, which gives the direction of time. And the
Well, like a
alternative-
hierarchy.
Well, that's the first step of manifestation.
Because, see, ordering is one of the key concepts, one of the major concepts in science is causality, cause-effect
that's
relationship.
connected
and
with
that's
but
connected with order.
but you
a
also-
sequence of events. In other words, before the window doesn't break before I throw the rock at it.
Right.
And not usually.
But-
Let me ask you this about causality. You've been doing a lot more science, a lot more in touch with it than I've been. Are people nowadays saying that causality is anything more than invariant association in time?
Well, I would say that there's levels. One thing is we haven't defined the scientific method. I don't know if that's been done in an earlier session. I think maybe we should discuss that a little bit. But one of the tenets of science, there's certain concepts that, like Immanuel Kant came up with the concept of categorization, which we've discussed in detail, which is a sort of a Socratean view that there are classes of objects that are kind of inherent or innate in our structure of our consciousness. There is this concept of causality, that there's a sequence, an ordering of events that so-called makes some sense to us.
Right.
But it's a very basic concept in physics. In fact, these two concepts are, object grouping, categorization, as people identify plants and all the different kinds of plants. I mean, that's a very basic phenomenon in science, and so is causality. There's another thing.
No, well,
You're
let me
not coming directly to answer your Harris's
a
question.
long time ago, I was taught that post hoc ergo propter hoc was a logical fallacy, and the more I thought about it, it became clear that is a definition of causality. That if one thing happens and then always
the other
something
thing,
else,
there's associated other
right,
thing.
that's what we mean when we say that the first. So the question is there really a distinction?
I don't think
Every
there is.
time we see things happening in sequence like that, if it's consistent, do we then always say that the first thing has caused the second?
Well, I think we tend to have an attribute of mind that tends to make that association, and we operate under that supposition that, in fact, that's what usually happens is you have two things associated, and then when you see something outside of that, then you check to see whether you have an error, that you recheck that to make sure that you haven't made a mistake. And then you may find that the relationship involves more, or that you just made an observational error and that you rechecked it. In other words, we tend to memory bank a whole bunch of fact relationships, and it's mostly relationships. I'll give you an example. I was driving along, and I saw a car, and it looked like there was a chipmunk in the car. Now, my association is that the chipmunk wouldn't survive in a closed car and wouldn't be still. It turned out it was a rag folded up, and it just looked like that kind of an object to me. It made me recheck, because my causal relationship of what might be the case in my memory bank said that this was an inappropriate conclusion. So I re-examined the situation. That's what we usually do. Now, we may find, indeed, that there was a chipmunk in the car due to some prior explanation. Then you have to expand the class of relationships of causality, but you still retain the principle.
Right. I sort of feel like we should move on to,
Okay,
Yeah,
I
something
think
to
so.
some of the other topics. And one of the things we wanted to get into was the whole issue of why many scientists seem to be so threatened by parapsychological phenomenon. Why it is that the resistance level is so high, much higher than for results in many other fields. Now, I'm particularly interested in one sidelight of this, which is what it is about the psychological makeup of individual psychiatrists, individual scientists, and the ways that people self-select themselves to be scientists. That means that there's that creates this group of people called scientists that seem to have a lot of paranoia about their assumptions being attacked.
Do you want me to address myself to that first? Or?
If, I'd like to say something, but after,
Well, go ahead.
after you ladies first.
Go ahead.
Anyway, yes, I've had a lot of experience with that. In fact, what's interesting to me is I guess I had a naivete about the whole thing, which I'd have to start this way. I feel that nothing is beyond examination. In other words, you examine it and see whether it appears to be amenable to the scientific method, and if it does, you set up experiments. Even if it doesn't exist, you can use science to find that out. And so I see nothing as beyond an attempt to examine. I mean a phenomena. I don't necessarily mean defining values, but you know, is there a Loch Ness monster or not? Well, I asked my students this, and I had a drawing that had been made in an ad for Scotch, and I said, "Does this exist or not?" You know, and I passed the Xerox copies around. Well, it exists as a concept, at least, at a minimum. But is there a physical counterpart? Is what science would ask. I mean, could you go out and find a Loch Ness monster? Well, I don't see anything wrong with going out and taking sonar or nets, or except that maybe you ought to leave if there is a creature, leave it alone. But I mean, science has a right to go out and, you know, set up scientists, let's put it that way, have a right to go out with nets and sonar and try to see whether a Loch Ness monster exists or not. Well, say it doesn't, it's still appropriate by the scientific method to go look for it.
Right.
And this is the thing that bothers me when I found that there were apparent buttons getting pushed if you examine certain types of phenomena. And I really see nothing wrong with examining that. And,
but why are those buttons there?
Okay, I really actually started reading. Glenn T. Seaborg had written a paper on the personality profile of scientists. Now, why does a person become a scientist? That's a question you could ask. I examined that within myself. Well, it's a very nice certain method. In other words, if you play this protocol or game in a certain way, you presumably can get certain answers. This either exists or it doesn't, or it's outside the framework or it's inside of the framework. So it's certainty. The certainty of methodology is exceedingly attractive. But I think the problem becomes when you get convinced that it's going to give you all the answers. Now, I think you can give it a good go and see whether it does come up with all the answers, and I, at this point, think that it won't. But that doesn't mean I don't find it a wonderful tool and enjoy it immensely, and it's given me a lot of information. Now, there's certain phenomena that have been thought to be outside the domain of science, like comets. They were thought to be the hand of God. Well, they still might be the hand of God, but they turn out to be a rock with gas around it. And that's the same thing with, trying to examine the space-time independence of consciousness. In other words, can clairvoyance or telepathy in the common vernacular, does it exist or not? And if it does exist, what are its properties? And so I got involved in examining this. Certainly I'm very interested in what the nature of consciousness is, and I felt that this might have a clue if it did exist. And I was exceedingly skeptical about some of the discussion of parapsychology. I came from an extreme skepticism,
right,
but I was totally open to the possible existence. And so what I found is we did do some experiments, and there seems to be a persistent and relatively strong phenomena.
Right. You're not.
Okay. Now
You're
what
not
I'm saying is,
question
after I
of
got
why
my data as a good scientist, I go report it. In other words, you collect the data and then you go report it. Now, what I found was the response in some case was extremely emotional. Mostly, in other words, a true scientist would have no emotional response. They would say, probably, I don't believe a word you say, but I think it could be examined by science.
I claim that a true scientist would have an emotional response, and the response would be, oh, wow, gee whiz.
Yeah, well, they would say this. I mean, I would expect that they would have to replicate the experiment to believe it at this point because of the controversy around psi. But what I didn't understand is people who would say, if you study this phenomenon, you will not only destroy all of science, but all of civilization, which Carl Sagan and Isaac Asimov has said. And I was astounded by that. What do you mean that the study of psi would actually destroy? How do you mean? How would you define destroying civilization? It might change your conceptual framework to some degree. So it might modify, but that's what science does. Relativity modified Newtonian mechanics. This is modifying But it isn't a drastic thing that is going to throw out science or destroy
yes,
science. And
yes,
but what I'm saying is I think that people who are reacting that way have taken this secure causal belief system of science and extended it to their whole life. And therefore, what you're doing is threatening their personal security, their personal philosophy, and the reaction is from fear.
Okay. We're running a little short of time, so I'd like to get Arthur's comments on why are scientists like that anyway?
Well, I think it's true of everybody. I recall when my wife and I first communicated through a medium and got some information that we thought was valid, the bottom fell out of my stomach, and likewise her. It was a very uncomfortable feeling. And of course I was asking for it, but the actual experience was different from the intellectual thing. And I later conducted these experiments where people do what equivalent to distant viewing. This was back in '52. We called it do-it-yourself. Everybody could do it.
Mm-hmm.
But when I tried to do it myself, I got quite good success, and I was completely discombobulated. I had to retire for 3 weeks in the country and cool off. But I was asking for it.
Mm-hmm.
How can I blame the scientist who isn't asking for it, who runs into the same thing? And I think many of them protect themselves from it by not doing it. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
they don't often try to do the ESP experiments. But that gets into the whole question of psychology, and I would like to say that I think some scientists are psychotic, but to make it interesting, I would have to mention names, and that wouldn't be quite fair. I know one book mathematician or a mathematical journalist wrote not one but 3 books against numerology.
That's amazing.
Now the lady protests too much.
That's what I mean. See, there are many things that I would say I'd have to say I'm skeptical about. What I do is I either examine it or ignore it. In other words, if it's
maybe because you're a woman, you don't get this crisis that a man does when he's meeting this other side of himself.
Well, let's not get into that issue. But I would say, because there's another, that's more than an hour. But I would say yes. Okay, when I got to the point where I decided there was some phenomena going on, maybe that was remote perception. I had a couple of days where I had to readjust my belief system to handle that, not only from the point of view of incorporating that into my philosophy, although I think I prepared for it, decided that I would be happy if it was real, although, as I say, I was very skeptical. But then I also had to confront that as a scientist, if I start reporting this, I had some inkling, but not very much, that I might run into some controversy. I ran into more controversy than I expected. So it was 2 levels. In other words, you get the information, you decide it's real, and then what do you do with it? Well, as a scientist, you report it to your colleagues. And, I even found that it was sort of difficult for me to be in an environment where there were many skeptics. And it's like, in a sense, at first you have to sort of reinforce, in other words, go do some more experiments to really incorporate that into your personal philosophy, personal psychology.
I think there's a tendency on the part of people with an emotional commitment to skepticism, not to skepticism, but to refusal to belief, to say, no, that doesn't happen, when what they ought to be saying is, I'd rather not hear about that.
That's fine, and I respect that. If the person does not want to hear about it, I see no purpose.
But that's a very embarrassing thing for a scientist to say. It's easier to claim that you're lying than to admit a profound desire not to hear it.
Or mistaken. Actually, the main usually is I'm fortunate that I've just been accused of being terribly mistaken, which is probably better than lying. But I also feel there are scientists that talk about ESP an awful lot and won't go out and do the experiments, and that surprises me. Why would they not commit themselves at a level and go See, the truth is more important than anything. I mean, if you have to totally give up your belief system, your philosophy, everything in a search for truth, you have to be willing, that's a true scientist, to be willing totally to be able to say, I will give up my belief system if it's wrong. Why keep it?
I think if we're going to explore this at all fully, one of the things we have to get into is looking at two competing motivations for scientists.
Mm-hmm.
One of the motivations being science, and the other being careerism.
Yes.
And and you
That's
can't
fair.
really come down all that hard on people for being concerned with their careers and not wanting to get on a limb and sort of feeling, well, if everyone else is going to be crazy and dishonest, then I might as well go along with it a little bit so as to not be ostracized. I mean, certainly understandable that
That's a very
human beings
unfortunate situation
will-
in science, extremely unfortunate. In other words, if science is some methodology for the search for correct information, truth, then it's a very... See, what's the advantage, and we can come back to Arthur's comment on women. Women aren't getting anywhere anyway in science that much, and maybe I have the advantage that, in a certain sense, I have nothing to lose. But that being aside, I think that is one of the most unfortunate situations, that there is not a more free rein to pursue the direction that your research is taking you.
Right. And this raising these issues changes the whole context of this discussion from a discussion of issues in philosophy of consciousness to issues in political funding of science to issues of the sociology of science.
That's another whole level, although most
And
of them that are
I don't-
extremely emotionally involved are coming from the point of view of a personal. As Arthur says, you do have to go through kind of an emotional, maybe a few sleepless nights dealing with what you really think's going on, and it's sort of like revising your personal view of the world, and that's a heavy experience. Yes, I agree with that.
Oh, have you any other questions? Let's get on, because
Well,
to me
this is really
covered this.
this was really the synthesis of everything that I wanted to talk about.
Well, what you said about keeping to a career, raises the question of whether science isn't really more politics than it is the search for truth. And I regret to say that that's what I, in fact, find it to be. And there's no telling when somebody's going to see the emperor hasn't any clothes, and then the game will shift.
Mm-hmm.
But I've waited a long time for that, 30 years, and
Okay,
no
well,
sign of it.
we're running out
I
of
think
time.
there may be, let me land on an optimistic point of view. Between now, when I first suggested even researching Psi in '71, I have people that would actually walk across the hall to avoid me like I had the plague, asking to be involved in my experiments. They're well-known, internationally known scientists. I've been asked all over the world to give lectures on both my physics and science parapsychology work. So I would have to say that I think I see a tremendous optimistic change in my personal experience. So although sometimes it's very frustrating and so forth, I'd have to give an optimistic feeling to that.
As the most intransigent people retire and/or die off,
That's an element.
There's a lot of hope for more open-minded people taking positions of more respectability and authority. And I'm certainly with you. I want to see these issues investigated. Well, thank you for participating in the conversation
Thank you,
today.
Harris.
Well, thanks
Thank
for
you,
having me.
Elizabeth.
It's good seeing you again. Good meeting you.